back to the channel, everyone. Again, thanks for everyone that's watching the videos. I really appreciate it. Thanks for the feedback. So we're going to start preparing the crankshaft, and what we're doing with it today, if you've noticed, the crankshaft is in a garbage bag, but if you watch the previous video, you'll see that I cleaned it and polished it, but then what I did was I put WD-40 to kind of coat it and protect it from any more rust. So we're going to take it out of the bag, we're going to clean it where it's dry, and then once that it's dry, we're going to install the crank bearings, and we're going to measure to make sure. A couple of things that we want to check is we want to check to make sure that the crank is not out of round, and we also want to make sure that we have the proper bearings and bearing clearances for when we install the crank. So it's probably going to be 2 videos because it's a little slow in the beginning with the measurements and finding out the actual situation of our crank. So let's get started. Looks like it really stayed clean. I'm very happy about that. I'm going to go ahead and throw the bag away because hopefully we'll be able to get this part done today. I want to start by taking a clean towel and just wiping some of the residue off the crank. And when I put the protectant on, I didn't put a lot on. All I wanted to do was coat the surface so that it would keep it from flash rusting. And remember, in the previous video, it rusted really quick. So that brings me to another point of when you store your engine parts after you've cleaned them, you want to make sure that you have some kind of protective coating on them to keep the part, again, from flash rusting. So the parts that we're going to measure today are going to be, when we check for out of round, is going to be everything. And when we check the way that the crank sits in the engine, we're going to check what's called the main journals. This is where the pistons, the connecting rods to the pistons set. So all we're going to check today is the out of roundness. So just to make sure that I have a really good clean surface to work off of, put down some fresh shop towels. To put my crank on. Again, it is very important that you stay as clean as possible for this procedure. Again, use compressed air. I'm going to use the drill with the brass brush again, and the reason that I'm going to do that is I want to make sure that all of my bolt holes, this is where we're going to mount the holes, or mount the crank whenever we check for the bearing clearance. Again, each bearing has 4, 5, and 6 holes. So let's do these first. Now, once that you have cleaned out the threads of where the crank mounting bolts are going to go, you're going to want to use compressed air to blow out any debris that is left over in the holes. This is a real important part to use safety glasses, as it could blow any metal that you have trimmed, or any dirt or debris that has fell into the holes. So let's blow these out. One thing that I want to do before I check my bearings is just to use a little degreaser just to wipe my surfaces down. It's very important that these surfaces are very clean so that you can get an accurate measurement. Your measurement is within a thousandths. So it's really important to make sure that everything is really clean. And remember, we use coffee filters just to double check. Let's check that first one. That looks great. I wonder if we're going to today. Then I'm going to go over one more time. And use compressed air again. All right, so here are the main crank bearings. It's by Engine Tech. The part number is BC409JSTD. They're aluminum silicon. They're interchangeable with part 7298M-STD MB529SI, and they're made in Israel. The Engine Tech also has the UPC code of 707-473-043-779. And these were made 08/9 of 2022. Let's see what we have. Again, great packing. I love the way that the bearings are. Now, if you notice, you have this type of bearing and this type of bearing. This is where the main thrust bearing, is what it's called, is on this engine. And it just so happens on the LS that the main thrust bearing is in the center. Now, some of the bearings have holes. The holes are going to be the bearings that go on the bottom. And the reason is because, as we talked before, this is the oil gallery, that as oil circulates through the engine, it comes up through here, and you want oil to get on the inside of the bearings to be able to lubricate the bearings. So, if you also, I'll show, there's something else right here. You can kind of notice a little bit of a discoloration. The same here and here. That shows the second bearing hole. So by looking at that, I'm going to know the way that my bearings are going to go in. I'll show you. One thing that you want to do while you're handling your bearings is be very careful. You don't want to damage this surface. This is the surface where the oil is going to oil the crank. Now, as I said, they go in the center, which puts this bearing here in the center of the crank. One thing though to notice is, again, you have one with holes and one without. This is our bottom bearing, and this is the top bearing. So let's go ahead. We're going to be using our bottom for this exercise. We'll put our top one here. Now, all the bearings that are in this pack are the same size, but you're going to have top and bottom bearings. And I'll show you again, it's back to the one that has the holes. And I'm trying to be very careful with unwrapping them so that the razor blade does not damage the bearing. If there are any questions about any of the part numbers that I use, please feel free to DM me, make a comment. So you're supposed to have 8 bearings here, 4 and 4. Here are the bearings with the holes. These are my 4 bottom bearings. These are without the holes. They're my 4 top. So, the way that they'll look inside the engine, if you will, are like this. These are my bottom, these are my top. Now, just like I did with the surfaces in the block, I'm actually going to get a fresh towel. And right now, I'm only going to be working with the bottom bearings. You kind of just want to wipe the bearing off so that there's nothing on it that can get in the way of your measurements. Notice too how the bearing has a channel. That's when the oil comes in to the bearing surface, it can help lubricate it. One thing that is important when you're putting together an engine is to have precise measurements, but also to make sure everything is very clean. Now, in my house, because I have 3 dogs and a cat, I really have to pay close attention for animal hair. It seems to be on everything. Another thing to point out on the bearings is on one side of the bearing, it has a notch. That notch helps you ensure that you're installing the bearing in the right place. So here are some numbers on the crank bearings. M5299, actually that's a 3, US1, which is SCSTD. Guessing that's standard, because I'm not 100% sure, but they are standard bearings. I purchased them under standard. So, now that we have the bearings ready for a dry fit, very important, I want to mention a dry fit. For this step, you are going to install the crankshaft, but you're going to install it without any assembly lube because you want a measurement, and what we use with the power strips the surface needs to be really dry, and we'll go into this in a second, but it's called Plastigage. You can get that pretty much anywhere. The brand that I got was All Star Performance Plastigage Kit 96475. I got this off of Amazon. I can't remember the price, but I'll put it in the video. All right, so we have the bottom main thrust bearing. Another thing to notice is in the block, you're going to see these look the same, except this has a groove right here. that groove matches this thick lip. And again, we have a set of numbers, F5293 S1 standard. The oil gallery is here. And all I did was push it down by hand. Feels kind of level, but when we set the crank in there, we're really going to know. Now, the bearings that I mentioned before that have the notch, notice that corresponding in the engine block is a notch. And I'll seat it just like I did the main bearing. I want to line it up and it seats. Now notice one thing that I think is really well designed is where the oil gallery comes up here, there's this channel which allows oil to flow. The channel also allows the second bearing hole to provide oil as well. Lining up the channel. And seating the bearing. But one thing that I noticed that is different between a LS engine, LS series engine, and an older small block Chevrolet engine, 350 or whatnot, is that your main bearing is in the center. It's not on the end. I'm super stoked about this. This is looking so good. Now, what I want to do is I want to just gently set the crank into the bearings. Now, with the crankshaft, this is going to be the front, this is the rear. And you want to be very careful putting the crank in so that you don't damage anything, any of the bearings that you've put in the engine. So, very slow and very easy. All right. So now that we've set the crank in there, it's set down very easily. It felt good. Kind of look at the surfaces. Everything looks really nice. Okay. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to get our main bearing mounts. Here are the main bearing mounts. They've been cleaned, but they have a lot of fuzz on them and stuff off of the towels I've used. But what I want to do is, again, wipe my part down, make sure that there's no dirt, and you'll see that there's 2 marks in this one. So what does that mean? If you notice, like we mentioned here, that you have a place for the notch there, And when you line up the top bearing, it's going to have a notch here that holds this bearing in place. So that means when you go to install it, this notch is going to sit on top of that bearing. When you set this in, it's going to go into there, but it's going to set opposite so that this almost locks the other bearings in place. And what I mean by that is once that you set this in, this is going in the engine block. Just like that. And another thing to point out is they're also numbered. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, if we want to double check behind ourselves, remember our main bearing has this groove. And number 3 also has that groove. So that is where number 3 will go. Now, one thing that we want to do before we go to check for our clearance is we want to check and make sure that the crank is not out of round. I should have did that before I set it the engine, but I didn't do it rough or anything like that where it could cause any damage. So let's go back and let's check the crank to see if it is out of round. To check to see if the crank's out of round, we're going to use this micrometer set. These are really nice because you can have, and again it has some of the similar parts, an anvil. This is how you set your measurements. This is your locking mechanism. But we're not looking for a particular thickness as much as I want to make sure that there's no ovalness in the crank. So again, very easy. Remove the crankshaft. and we're going to check for out of round. What you want to do is take your micrometer and you loosen your lock so that you have a really easy moving anvil. Then you kind of put it in the center like this, tighten it down. You don't want it too tight. You want it to be able to easily move along the crank. And I'm using a 2 to 3 inch. So right now, let's check the first one. I think I'm a little too tight. And the part that I'm checking now is for the pistons. We've already checked this one. Measures really good. Very nice. Okay, so let's check where the crank is going to mount. And we're going to have to open it up quite a bit more. As you're moving it around, it should be a very smooth fit. You should barely feel it dragging. The crank main journals is going to be, and the way this measurement works, I'll do another video on how to read these. And for the connecting rods for the pistons, below. Okay, so we verified that our crankshaft is not out of round. It fits nicely, it feels nicely. This is the original crankshaft that came with the engine, so I really wasn't worried about it being out of round or anything, but it's really important to use this when you buy an aftermarket crank or you get a crank machined, just to double check to make sure that everything is measuring right. Now we're going to reinstall our crankshaft, and again, be very easy. All right, we've seated it. Now, I want to go over this a little more because this is important, and I want to make sure that I have it right. So the way that you want to fit now, look in my manual to verify. You're going to have, and they're all numbered as I mentioned. Number 1 is going to be facing this way, and number 2, number 3, number 4, and number 5. It'll be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Almost like the numbers that I have from when we did the cam bearings. One thing is, after you mount the 2 crank mount bolts here and the one for here, it goes into here. So it basically kind of secures the block at 6 different points per mount. All right, let's try those gloves now. It's very important to know what position and which way that they're facing. And what I'm using for reference is the 6-liter manual that tells me where everything goes. I'm going to lightly clean the bearings. Number 1. We'll wipe it down And I'm going to clean these holes as well. And remember, this is a dry fit. We're going to use the bearing key or notch again, and we're trying to wonder, well, which way does this face? Well, you want it opposite from the other bearing. So this is the way that the bearing, or pardon me, the mount goes into the engine. So what I want to do is I want to put my bearing with the notch on this side. And again, make sure my surfaces are as level as I can get them. And what it does is it puts the notch over here and then the notch on this side. And it prevents the bearings from moving around. Double check my mounting surfaces. And that's where it's going to go. So we're going to repeat the same exact process for the rest. Alright, so I want to go over really quick before we do our plastic gauge how the actual mounts mount. This is the front of the engine. It's where number 1 goes, number 2, 3, 4, then 5. But notice the way that they face. Number 1 faces this way, 2, 3, 4, but 5 is opposite. It's very important that you follow your technical data when you are mounting your pieces. So everything looks and feels like it fits very nicely. All right, now what I want to do in the next video is I'm going to put our plastic gauge in, and I'm going to actually torque the mains, still a dry install, but I'm going to torque them down to factory specifications so that I can measure to make sure that we're going to be okay. And we'll also repeat the process when we mount the pistons. But for now, what I want to do is I want to show you one thing that I want to use is, even though I purchased new main bearing bolts, there's a reason why I did that. These are the bearing bolts that I removed from the engine. The bolts are what is known as torque to yield bolts, which means that as the bolt is going down to the block, it stretches the material the bolt is made out of to hold it at a certain tightness. So as a general rule, with the new ones that I bought, you can torque them 3 times before they lose their accuracy. But what I want to do is I'm going to use the original bolts that came out of the engine, so that when I use my new bolts and I torque them, they've only been torqued 1 time. It's during the install, so I know that that is the most accurate that I can get them. But before I use these, I obviously degreased them. I want to clean any of the material off of the threads. So we're going to do that really quick, and we're going to set up for the actual measurement. So I'm going to finish out this video by cleaning all of these, and I'll clean one on the camera so that you can see how it's done. Again, this is probably important to wear eye protection. I'm going to use my bench grinder on this, and I want to remove any of the material that is on the bolt. So you see the bolt is, I'm really not too worried about this part being rust free. It's mainly just the thread so that I can get an accurate torque. I'm going to go ahead and clean the rest of these bolts. I appreciate everyone for stopping by. I want to thank Brian Tooley Racing for their support, and also I want to give, for my shout out, I really have to talk about Chloe and Robert. Congratulations on your graduation. Well done. Both of you guys are honors. I'm so proud. You guys have worked very hard. So this video is for my son Robert Morgan and Chloe Mackay.